amazing World War I facts that you probably don't know. World War I often conjures up images of a horrific bloodbath fought in the trenches of the Western Front. While this certainly captures some of the reality, did you know that the war spread as far as China, or that it was fought by servicemen and women from Asia, North America, the Caribbean, Australia, and Africa? Here are some surprising facts about World War I that you probably didn't know. An explosion on the battlefield in France was heard in London. While the war raged on in the mud and the trenches, a very different war was taking place beneath the soldiers' feet. A group of miners operating in total secrecy dug tunnels up to 100 feet underground to plant and detonate mines beneath the enemy's trenches. Their biggest success was at Messines Ridge in Belgium, where over 900,000 pounds of explosives were simultaneously detonated in 19 underground tunnels. Much of the German front line was destroyed, and the explosions were heard 140 miles away by the British Prime Minister. Journalists faced execution. A handful of journalists risked their lives to report on the realities of war. As the government sought to control the flow of information from the front line at the start of the war, journalists were banned. Reporting on the conflict was, in the opinion of the War Office, helping the enemy. If caught, they faced the death penalty. World War I sparked the invention of plastic surgery. Shrapnel was the cause of many facial injuries in World War I, and unlike the straight-line wounds inflicted by bullets, the twisted metal shards produced from a shrapnel blast could easily rip a face off. Horrified by the injuries he saw, Surgeon Harold Gillius took on the task of helping victims and pioneered early techniques of facial reconstruction in the process. Wilfred Owen was unknown at the end of the war. Wilfred Owen is one of the best-known poets of World War I, but when he died on the front line just a week before the end of the war, he was relatively unknown. At the time, his view of the war as one of pity and horror was in the minority. It wasn't until the 1960s that a literary elite decided this was the most authentic view of the conflict because it chimed with their own anti-war feelings. This resulted in the publication of two key war poetry anthologies which heavily featured Owen. Blood banks were developed during World War I. The British Army began the routine use of blood transfusion in treating wounded soldiers. Blood was transferred directly from one person to another. A U.S. Army doctor, Captain Oswald Robertson, established the first blood bank on the Western Front in 1917, using sodium citrate to prevent the blood from coagulating and becoming unusable. Blood was kept on ice for up to 28 days and then transported to casualty clearing stations for use in life-saving surgery where it was needed the most. Colorful makeovers meant World War I ships hid in plain sight. It was crucial to protect the merchant ships carrying the food and military supplies to the front from enemy torpedoes. Norman Wilkinson, an artist and Royal Navy volunteer, came up with the idea of covering ships in bold shapes and violent contrasts of color, the complete opposite of normal camouflage. Dazzle camouflage was supposed to confuse the enemy rather than conceal the ships. Generals were banned from going over the top. The stereotype is that the ordinary soldiers of World War I were lions, led by donkeys, the donkeys being incompetent generals who sat out the war in comfort while thousands died unnecessary deaths. In fact, so many of the generals wanted to be closer to the fighting, they had to be banned from going over the top because they kept getting killed. The experience required to be a general was too significant to lose.